Hi, my name is Jessica and I'm one of the tour docents here at Tuckahoe Plantation near Richmond, Virginia. Tuckahoe is unique among plantations, first because it was the boyhood home of Thomas Jefferson. He was here for 7 years from ages 2 to 9, and he would have been educated right here on the property in that tiny little schoolhouse building off to the right. Plantations at that time were almost like miniature towns. Traveling was very difficult because they had no paved roads back then. So pretty much everything that they needed, they either had to make, grow, or raise right here on the property. For that reason, we had many different buildings here on the farm, and we're very fortunate that so many of them are still standing today. And we're going to see some of those in just a few minutes. So now we are upstairs in the north section of the house in one of the bedrooms. It's quite possible that Thomas Jefferson would have stayed in this room while he was here at Tuckahoe. But before houses had running water, they had to do things a little bit differently because they had no sinks, no showers, no flushing toilets. So this piece here would have been an essential part of your morning routine. You have a wash basin up top here. You could fill that up with water, wash your face, wash your hands. They may have used soap, maybe not. In the back, there's also a mirror that pulls up as well. And hidden down below, you have a little chamber pot, which was their version of a toilet. After you were done, close it all up. You would never know what was inside. This kind of furniture was called Deceptive Furniture because it was designed to look very nice and elegant on the outside and concealed its true function on the inside. Now, not everyone would have been able to afford such nice pieces of furniture for their chamber pots. Most of the time, they had their chamber pots sitting in the corner of the room or tucked underneath the bed. And it would have been the servant's responsibility to empty the chamber pot every day. They certainly had a different idea of hygiene in those days. Now, more than ever, we understand how important it is to keep clean and to wash our hands often with soap. But they didn't understand the connection between dirt and disease. In fact, they believed that to submerge your body in water would invite disease into the body and could cause illness. That may be one of the reasons why they didn't bathe as often as we do today. They also had a very different idea of dental hygiene in those days. So nowadays we're told to brush our teeth 2 or 3 times a day. They probably didn't brush nearly that often. And if they did, they might have used a little twig and maybe a dirty piece of cloth. Fortunately, today we understand far more about germs and diseases, and as a result, people are living far longer than they used to in those days. We're now inside the Great Hall, which would have been the social entertaining space of the house. If you are a guest or a visitor here at Tuckahoe, this is probably where you would have been spending the bulk of your time. Now, guests weren't just coming for a couple of hours in the afternoon to visit. They could be here for weeks, months, sometimes years. The family was often very busy running the household and managing the plantation, and they certainly didn't have the time to entertain their guests for hours on end every day. So the guests were typically left to their own devices here. They would pass the time by reading, doing needlework, or sometimes playing music, as there was often some sort of musical instrument somewhere in the room. This is the formal dining room of the house. This is where the adult family members and any guests would have taken their meals. Children likely would have been eating downstairs in the basement until they were old enough to be able to behave themselves properly at the table. In this room, we have some really wonderful examples of the etching on the glass. It was quite common for guests and visitors to sign their names on the glass. It was not considered rude or destruction of property, it was really their version of a guest book. There are 2 doors along the outer wall in this room. This one here encloses a dumbwaiter, which is essentially a little elevator that they would use to send food up from the basement into the dining room. And this second door here leads all the way to the outside. It goes down some steps and leads along the path called the Batter Cake Express. And it goes straight to the old kitchen building. They never ever had their kitchens inside the plantation house because they didn't want to accidentally burn down their beautiful home in a kitchen fire. So they situated the building well away from the home. This is the old kitchen building, which, as you can see, is situated quite a ways away from the main house. The path that runs along here is the Batter Cake Express, which we mentioned earlier, leading up to the stairs that go directly inside the dining room. Now, the kitchen building was originally built of wood, but as you may have guessed, it caught fire and burned to the ground, so it was rebuilt as brick around 1800. So now we're inside the old kitchen. You can see the massive fireplace here with this very large cauldron. It would have taken about 2 hours to heat up well enough to actually do any cooking with that. So they likely had a fire going all day long, even in the summertime. So this would have been a very hot and dangerous place to be. It was dangerous primarily because of the style of dress at that time, which was very different from how we dress today. The women wore these long flowing dresses, and if they were working here in the kitchen, they were right by open flames, and it was very easy for their clothing to catch fire. Unfortunately, many women were badly burned or even killed because of accidents with cooking fires at plantations over the years. This herb garden is a more modern addition behind the old kitchen building, but they certainly would have grown a variety of herbs here on the property. Herbs were important not only for cooking and seasoning the food, but also for medicinal purposes as well. Because it was so difficult to travel in those days, it was very difficult to get a doctor here on the property if anyone needed medical attention. So if anyone was ill or injured, they typically went to the lady of the house first. She was expected to be able to cure minor aches and pains, and she did this by making creams and tonics out of the various herbs that grew here on the property. This is what we call Plantation Street, and this was the location of a number of the outbuildings here on the property. These first 2 cabins would have been living quarters for some of the enslaved people working here, most likely ones that worked exclusively inside the plantation house. The majority of them would have been working out in the fields, and they would have had simpler quarters further out. Now, we've talked a little bit about life here on the farm for the plantation owners, but it would have been a completely separate story for the enslaved people working here. These cabins actually had a dividing wall down the center, and there would have been a family living on either side, so they certainly didn't get a lot of space. They were forbidden to own property. They couldn't vote or get married, be educated. They had absolutely no rights under the law because they were considered property. They were forced to work long hours, often doing back-breaking labor in the fields. And they would have been the ones plowing the fields, planting the crops, tending the animals, working in that dangerous old kitchen building. And they were never paid for their work. All of the profits always went to the landowner. And of course, the more land he had, the more money he made. We have very few early records of the enslaved people here at Tuckahoe, but at its peak, it was believed there were over 100 working here on the farm. Some records have survived from the 1850s, shortly before the Civil War, from when the Allen family owned the property. There's one document that lists out the names of the 62 enslaved workers. It also lists their ages, their shoe sizes, and where they worked here on the farm. After the Civil War, a number of them decided to remain here at Tuckahoe after they were freed and worked as paid servants. Harriet, pictured here in the center, was the last person to be born into slavery at Tuckahoe. She was one of those who stayed with her family after they were freed and worked as a paid servant until her death sometime after 1920. Some of the other buildings that you see along Plantation Street include the old stable building behind me, which we believe was originally the blacksmith. On this side, the first building would have been the smokehouse, where they would have prepared and stored meat. And you have a storage house as well behind. Every building here had a function and a purpose to try to make the plantation as independent and self-sufficient as possible. Well, that wraps up our segment for today. Thank you so much for joining me, and I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit more about Tuckahoe Plantation.